The battle began in the afternoon. Alexander led the companion cavalry across the Panaris River on the right side of the field at a full gallop. The charge was fast, violent, and absolutely decisive. The Persian left flank, made up of lighter cavalry and infantry, buckled almost immediately under the weight of the Macedonian assault. Alexander drove through them like a spear through cloth. And once through, he didn't stop to mop up. He turned inward, straight toward the Persian center, straight toward Darius. Meanwhile, in the middle of the field, the fighting was brutal. The Macedonian phalanx crossed the river and slammed into the Greek mercenaries serving Darius. This was the most savage part of the battle. Greek against Greek, professional infantry against professional infantry. The phalanx formation was devastating in a head-on push, but the mercenaries knew how to fight against it. They targeted the gaps between the pike blocks. Men fell on both sides. The river ran red. For a time, the center wavered, and it looked like the mercenaries might actually break through. On the left, Parmenion was under enormous pressure. The Persian cavalry on that side of the field was hammering his position, trying to break through and roll up the Macedonian line. Parmenion held, barely. His men fought with their backs to the sea and their shields locked, absorbing charge after charge. It was grinding, desperate, ugly fighting, but they held. And that was all Alexander needed. Because on the right, Alexander had already torn through the Persian flank and was now driving directly at the heart of the Persian formation. The companion cavalry carved a path through bodyguards, infantry screens, and anyone who stood between them and the royal chariot. Ancient accounts describe Alexander fighting at the front, his armor streaked with blood, his horse driving forward through the chaos. And then Darius saw him coming. This is one of the most famous moments in ancient military history. The great king, ruler of the largest empire on earth, commander of an army that outnumbered his enemy by at least 2-to-1, looked across the carnage and saw Alexander the Great riding straight at him with the fury of a god behind his eyes. Darius turned his chariot around and ran. The ancient sources describe it vividly. Darius's chariot became entangled in the bodies and the chaos. He abandoned it, mounted a horse, and fled the battlefield at full speed, leaving behind his royal cloak, his bow, his shield, and eventually even his war chariot itself. He left his army, he left his camp, and most devastatingly, he left his family. His mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statara, and his daughters were all captured in the Persian camp after the battle. The moment Darius fled, the Persian army shattered. It happened exactly as Alexander predicted. The soldiers who had been fighting fiercely moments before simply stopped. Unit after unit broke and ran. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. Macedonian cavalry chased the fleeing Persians for miles, cutting them down in the fading light. Ancient sources claim Persian casualties ranged from 20,000 to over 50,000 dead. The Macedonians reportedly lost somewhere between 400 and 1,200 men, though those numbers are almost certainly underreported. The aftermath was staggering. Alexander captured the entire Persian royal camp, gold, silver, Luxury goods, the personal treasury of the great king, all of it fell into Macedonian hands. More importantly, Alexander captured Darius's family. His mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statara, and his daughters were all taken alive. And here is where Alexander did something that elevated him from a great general to a legendary figure. He didn't harm them. He didn't humiliate them. He didn't parade them in chains. He treated them with full royal honors. He reportedly told Sisygambis that she had nothing to fear and that her son had not truly been a king worthy of the title, while Alexander would treat her as his own mother. The ancient sources say Sisygambis was so moved by Alexander's treatment that even after his death years later, she mourned him and refused to eat, dying of grief shortly after. That single act of mercy echoed through history. It sent a message to every Persian noble, every satrap, every general. Alexander was not just a destroyer, he was a king who knew how to rule. And that message did as much to break the Persian Empire as any cavalry charge. Darius, meanwhile, fled east. He sent Alexander a letter offering to cede all territory west of the Euphrates and pay an enormous ransom for his family. Alexander's general, Parmenion, reportedly told him if he were Alexander, he would accept the offer. Alexander's response has become one of the most quoted lines in military history. He said, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." He rejected the offer entirely. He wasn't interested in half an empire. He wanted all of it. The Battle of Issus didn't end the war against Persia. Darius would regroup, raise another massive army, and face Alexander again at Gaugamela 2 years later. But Issus was the moment that the world understood that this young Macedonian king was not a regional threat. He was something the ancient world had never seen before. A force that could not be stopped by numbers, by wealth, or the greatest empire in existence. He was 22 years old. He had just defeated the King of Kings on his own territory, and he was just getting started. If this story hit you like a cavalry charge to the chest, share it with someone who loves history. And if you want to see the next battle in this series, subscribe and get ready, because the ancient world has a lot more blood to spill.
Every conqueror in history has one moment where the world decides if he's real or just lucky. For Alexander of Macedon, that moment came on a narrow strip of coastline in southern Turkey, where he stood face to face with the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. And instead of running, he charged straight into the heart of it. This is the Battle of Issus, and it didn't just change the war. It changed the entire course of human civilization. To understand what happened on that battlefield, you have to understand the two men standing on opposite sides of it. On one side was Alexander. He was 22 years old. He had already crossed the Hellespont with roughly 40,000 men, invaded the Persian Empire, and won his first major battle at the Granicus River. But Granicus was a warm-up. It was a regional fight against local Persian governors. The real Persian war machine hadn't shown up yet. Alexander knew that, his generals knew that, and deep down, every Macedonian soldier crossing into Asia Minor knew that sooner or later, the King of Kings himself would come. And he did. On the other side stood Darius III, the great king of Persia, ruler of the largest empire on the face of the earth. His domain stretched from Egypt to India. He commanded resources that Alexander couldn't even dream of. And when Darius finally decided to deal with the Macedonian problem personally, he brought everything. Ancient sources differ on the exact number, but estimates range from 100,000 to over 250,000 soldiers. Even the most conservative modern estimates suggest Darius had at least 100,000 men under his command. Cavalry, infantry, Greek mercenaries fighting for Persian gold, and the elite royal bodyguard known as the Immortals. Against that, Alexander had roughly 40,000. The odds were staggering. On paper, this should have been the end of Alexander's story. A young king who got too ambitious, pushed too far east, and was swallowed whole by the empire he tried to conquer. But Alexander wasn't reading that script. Now here's where it gets interesting. The geography of this battle is everything, and the fact that the two armies even met at Issus at all was the result of one of the most dramatic miscalculations in military history. Alexander had been moving south along the Mediterranean coast of modern-day Turkey, pushing through Cilicia towards Syria. Darius, meanwhile, had assembled his massive army in the plains of Mesopotamia, in what is now northern Iraq. That flat, open terrain was perfect for Darius. His cavalry was his greatest weapon, and he needed space to use it. On open ground, those tens of thousands of Persian horsemen could sweep around Alexander's flanks and crush him from every direction. But Darius made a decision that changed everything. Instead of waiting for Alexander to come to him on favorable ground, Darius moved. He marched his enormous army north and west, swinging around behind Alexander through the Amenini Gates, a mountain pass that brought him out onto the coastal plain near the town of Issus. In one move, Darius had cut Alexander's supply lines and positioned himself between Alexander and his route back to Greece. On paper, that sounds brilliant. In reality, it was a catastrophic mistake. Because by marching to Issus, Darius had taken his massive army out of the wide-open plains where his numbers would have been devastating and squeezed them into a narrow strip between the mountains and the sea. The battlefield was only about 2.5 kilometers wide. That meant Darius couldn't spread his army out. He couldn't use his cavalry superiority. He had voluntarily given up his greatest tactical advantage and walked into the one type of terrain where Alexander's smaller, more disciplined army could actually fight on equal terms. When Alexander received word that Darius was behind him, his generals panicked. Their supply lines were cut. The great king himself was at their backs with an army that dwarfed theirs. Every instinct said retreat. Every calculation said they were trapped. Alexander smiled. According to the ancient sources, he told his commanders that Darius had just handed them the victory. The Persians had given up the open ground. They were crammed into a narrow space, and now Alexander could do what he did best: hit them hard, hit them fast, and break them before their numbers could matter. The two armies faced each other across the Panaris River. It wasn't a mighty river. It was a shallow, rocky stream cutting through the coastal plain. But it mattered because it gave both sides a natural line to anchor on. Darius set up his army with Greek mercenary infantry in the center. These were professional soldiers, many of them as well-trained as Alexander's own Macedonians, and they were fighting for pay. They were dangerous. On the flanks, Darius positioned his cavalry and lighter infantry, and behind the lines, the great king himself sat in his royal chariot, surrounded by his personal guard, elevated so the entire army could see him. That visibility was both a strength and a fatal weakness, as events would prove. Alexander arranged his forces with surgical precision. On the right, he placed himself at the head of the companion cavalry, the elite Macedonian horsemen who had been trained since childhood to fight as a single devastating unit. In the center, he placed the Macedonian phalanx, the heavy infantry armed with the sarissa, a pike nearly 6 meters long. On the left, he placed Parmenion, his most experienced general, with orders to hold the line at all costs, while Alexander delivered the killing blow from the right. The plan was classic Alexander. Parmenion would anchor, the phalanx would engage, and Alexander himself would lead the hammer blow on the right flank, smashing through the Persian left and then wheeling inward toward one target: Darius himself. Because Alexander understood something about the Persian Empire that most commanders wouldn't have gambled on. The entire Persian army was held together by the presence of the king. If Darius fell or fled, the army would collapse. It wasn't a matter of morale, it was structural. Persian soldiers fought for their king. Remove the king, and there was nothing left to fight for. So Alexander wasn't trying to win a battle of attrition. He wasn't trying to grind down a force 3 times his size. He was going to cut the head of the snake.